I'm Professor Esther McIntosh. I'm the Director of the Centre for Religion in Society, and I'm delighted to see so many of you both here in person and online for our relaunch of the Ebor Lectures. To give you a bit of background for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with them, the Ebor Lectures in Theology and Public Life were established in 2006 here in York to promote conversation across a diversity of religious beliefs and issues of public concern. The Ebor Lectures are offered free of charge to the general public, providing a space where experts and practitioners from a range of communities, such as educational institutions, public interest groups, religious movements, charitable and political organisations, can share knowledge and provoke reflection, contributing to creative, personal and collective decision-making for the benefit of society. So previous speakers have included archbishops, cabinet ministers, social activists, journalists, astronomers, peace workers, authors, and many others. So today, the Ebor Lectures are returning in person for the first time since the COVID pandemic, and now in a hybrid format when it works. The Ebor Lectures are an ecumenical project jointly sponsored and organised by York Minster, the Methodist Church, Yorkshire North and East District, the C&JB Morale Trust, York Area Society of Friends, the Quakers, and the Centre for Religion Society here at York St John University. For this relaunch tonight, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Hannah Barham-Brown as our speaker. Hannah holds honours degrees in combined arts and in paediatric nursing. She's a governor of Motability, a GP, and an influential disability, gender, and LGBTQ+ activist, as well as a former deputy leader of the Women's Equality Party. She's also a company member of UN Women UK. She is an ambassador of the UK Design Council, the disability charity, My AFK, the gynaecological cancer charity, the Eve Appeal, and the bereavement charity, Good Grief Trust. And as if all that wasn't enough already, she's also a role model for the Lightyear Foundation, a charity breaking down barriers for disabled children taking part in science, technology, engineering, and maths. Hannah regularly works with international, national, and local media and has given 2 TEDx talks. Due to her work on closing the gender pay gap in medicine, diversifying the medical profession, and disability campaigning, Hannah has been named as one of the Health Service Journal's 100 most influential people in health, as well as being named on the Shaw Trust's 2018, 19 and 20 power lists, making her one of the 100 most influential disabled people in the UK. And tonight, the title of Hannah's talk is Vicarage and Vocation, the Impact of an Ecclesiastical Upbringing on a Very Public Life. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Is this mic quick? Yeah? Can you hear me? We all good? Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Wow, goodness, I'm intimidated myself. I'm Dr. Hannah Barham-Brown. It's lovely to be with you this evening. For those who may benefit from a visual descriptor, I'm a white woman with curly red hair, sitting in a very fancy pink power chair, and I'm wearing a suit because you're all terribly important. It's a real honour to be asked to give the first of the relaunched Ebor Lectures, if a little bit of a surprise, because I studied theology as an undergraduate. It was part of my first degree at Durham, and I was a pretty terrible theology student, by all accounts. I'll be honest, I mainly did the film modules. I applied for theology as a niche straight subject because I thought it might get me into Oxbridge. It didn't. And within about 3 weeks of getting to Durham, I moved to combined arts, took up some English and Arabic in the hope that as a combination I could become a war correspondent. I'm not a war correspondent. My mum told me I wasn't allowed because I'd get shot and end up in a wheelchair. And so the NHS got my soul instead. So yes, my theological career was quite short-lived and not particularly spectacular. I feel my first day, my card was somewhat marked by the legendary Professor Douglas Davies, who some of you may well have heard of. Dougie Davies lectured at Durham, still does, and had also lectured at Nottingham in their theology department beforehand. He looked at the register on my first day in my first lecture and said, "Barham," that's a terrible Welsh accent, I'm so sorry. "Barham, now are you Peter Barham's daughter?" I'm so, oh no. It's like, I lectured your father at Nottingham for his theology degree and he fell asleep in one of my lectures. Don't make the same mistake. So I moved to English quite quickly, but it's fair to say that I've not taken a traditional route with my arts degree. I'm not sure there is a traditional route for an arts degree, but I've ended up being a doctor, an activist, spending far too much time working in politics and the media, and I've had a pretty fascinating life so far, I think. I've managed to give some TED Talks. They were quite fun. Oh, I did wear a different suit, I just had to check. I've contested local, regional and national elections. Most recently, I contested the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner election for North Yorkshire in November 2021. Any of you who did vote for me, thank you very much. I got more than 10% of the vote on 3 weeks' notice, so I'll take that. I've had a few frank exchanges with some cabinet ministers. Dominic Raab became Foreign Secretary within a couple of weeks of meeting me. I think he just needed an excuse to leave the country. I think he's just about recovered. I'll let you be the judges of that. And I've also been #1 on the BBC Sounds app as their pick of the day whilst naked on what is called the Naked Podcast, where they get you to talk about your relationship with your body and sexuality whilst naked. It is just a podcast. Nobody saw anything, apart from the people who interviewed me, who very gamely also got naked. As I said, my life has been fascinating. Now, I feel I need to do a bit of a disclaimer in that I'm not particularly religious anymore as an individual for a range of complex reasons, some of which we will go into. But I do feel very strongly that I have benefited from being a vicar's kid. The skills I learnt as a child and a teenager through working with Dad have served me very well. I've learnt to be incredibly adaptable, which is handy as a doctor, because you never know what's coming through that door every 10 minutes. I've had to learn to do public speaking because I was speaking in public as soon as I could speak. I was also giving readings as soon as I could read. There was a theme here. I very quickly learnt the importance of community and of tackling social inequalities. I got a great example of what vocation means and commitment. And also I learned about the importance of speaking truth to power. And that's something I'm really going to talk about a lot today. So in terms of people I'd like to speak some truth to, here's another famous vicar's daughter. This is Theresa May. We've managed to kind of put a line across her face. That wasn't intentional, I promise. So for those who aren't able to see it for whatever reason, the quote below the photo of Theresa May says, "I have one memory, for example, of being in the kitchen and looking up the path to the back door where a whole group, a family, had come to complain about an issue in the church. And that's it. Just knock on the door and expect to see the vicar." Now, Theresa May very famously said that the most naughty thing she'd ever done as a child was running through a field of wheat. We didn't run through many fields of wheat, though I did nick the occasional sugar beet because I was brought up in Suffolk and that was the kind of main crop there. It turns out if you peel it, it's a bit like a turnip, and if you peel it, you can chew on it. It's actually really tasty, highly recommend. But that's about as outrageous as we got as vicar's kids. However, I can very much relate to this quote, because growing up as a vicar's daughter is a bit like growing up in a goldfish bowl. You have a lot of people who know very weirdly intimate things about your life as you grow up, and they're often turning up in your house unexpectedly. Vicarages don't have opening hours, they're just open, and vicars don't tend to work 9 to 5. And contrary to popular belief, they don't only work on a Sunday either, though I still will tease my father, telling him otherwise. So when Theresa May became Prime Minister, I was asked to write a piece for The Guardian about my experiences growing up as a vicar's daughter. And I said, you know, actually it is like growing up in a goldfish bowl. And you never know when you come downstairs in your pajamas of a morning, possibly slightly hungover, who is going to be in your living room. And on that note, I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly apologise to the Bishop of St Edmundsbury in Ipswich for him having seen that. It had been a rough night, but he was very charming about it at the time. One of the benefits of growing up in this existence, though, is that you end up with this huge community around you, this very tight-knit community, often of people that are quite a lot older than you, and you basically have a lot of surrogate grandparents, which was fortunate because I was freaking adorable. There was a lot of cute to go around, though I'm a bit worried that at the age of 36, I still haven't grown into those cheeks. As soon as I could talk, I was very much talking. And what we discovered more recently is that I grew up with undiagnosed ADHD. I have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is why I'm constantly playing with something in my hand, because it stops my brain wandering off and taking you down all sorts of fun rabbit holes. Really, you should be very grateful I'm playing with this thing right now. But one of the traits of small children with ADHD is that we are terrible at sleeping. And it's because we have FOMO. We get serious fear of missing out. So if the grown-ups are downstairs having a party or a meeting or whatever it might be, it's a lot easier just to bring said child downstairs, park them in the corner. I was nice as pie, I wasn't disruptive, I just wanted to know what was going on. And so from a very young age, I was being passed around a lot of adults and being spoken to by a lot of adults. I was often the oldest child of any congregation. And that meant I was quite precocious. I was speaking like a tiny adult at the age of 4 or 5. And it meant that I was very comfortable talking to complete strangers. Some would say too comfortable talking to complete strangers. As my parents found out, when we went on holiday to Scotland one year and they found me in a pub, they had taken me to the pub, I hadn't just wandered in a pub at the age of about 4 or 5, asking a big burly Scotsman why he was wearing a skirt. Fortunately, I looked like this, so I could get away with it. But it was quite an idyllic childhood in many ways. And one of my earliest memories is actually of my dad building a church. Casual. So my dad was actually a Baptist when I was born, and so I was dedicated. I wasn't baptised until I was 13, decided I wanted to get confirmed and realised there was a bit of extra paperwork and water and oil that needed flinging around before we could get to that. So Dad decided he was going to build a Baptist church in this village near Huntingdon in Cambridgeshire. And one of my earliest memories, I must have been about 3 or 4 at the time, was being inconsolably upset because my parents decided they were going to do a clear out of some of our unloved toys to donate to the creche and the Sunday school of this church. And I'd convinced myself that Twinkle, my teddy bear, was going to be donated to the creche of this church. I can confirm for anyone who's worried, Twinkle is very much safe, living in my house just outside Selby, very much still with us. But that was the kind of childhood I was brought into, was kind of like, you don't need this, let's give it to somebody who does. Okay, just not the teddy bear, please. So after he built a church, Dad felt that he was being called to the church Anglican ministry and went to Theological College in Lincoln. Well, I grew up surrounded by young wannabe priests, including some of the first women to ever be ordained. And my parents were very heavily involved in the campaign for the ordination of women. My mother was the press officer for the Lincoln branch of MAO, the Movement for the Ordination of Women, and tells me that she had to write 2 press releases in November of 1992, one in case the vote passed and one in case it didn't. So it's kind of fitting that I ended up doing so much media and politics because I was clearly surrounded by press officers from a very young age. And I do remember a tea towel in the house which said something along the lines of, a woman's place is in the house of bishops. Love it. Sadly, I don't really remember the party that must have happened in November 1992 in Lincoln Theological College, because some of the women that started the course with Dad had started not knowing whether they would ever be able to be ordained at the end of it. That was their determination, that they'd start a course hoping and literally praying that Synod would turn around and say, yeah, all right, in you come. And that, I think, had a really big impact on me growing up, seeing these kind of constant divisions and inequalities that were playing out in front of me, and this very challenging time for the church. But growing up in a theological college also had some weird moments and has had some long-term effects that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate. I was really enjoying watching Fleabag, the drama on the BBC. Anyone seen it? It's great, really good. Fine until there was a hot priest. That brought up a lot of confusing emotions for me. I was kind of like, ooh, ah, very awkward. But it was a lovely, lovely place to spend 3 years. There were lots of kids around, there were lots of communal meals, and I have some great memories of Dad taking me to eat choral evensong in Lincoln Cathedral, aged about 4 or 5. He would bribe me, because we're open to bribery, he would bribe me by taking me to the newsagent on the way, where I could get a pack of polos, and I was allowed to sit and eat the pack of polos through evensong as long as I stayed quiet. And I remember sitting in choral evensong with these huge wooden seats in Lincoln Cathedral that kind of envelop you with these amazing carvings, listening to the choristers, who at that point were all boys. In fairness, Lincoln Cathedral was one of the first choirs to have female choristers in 1995, which was sadly after we left, but it did take them until 2011 to have a woman on the back row. So again, I was loving the music, and I was seeing something that I would not be able to do, but that my brothers would, because I was a girl. And that was an incredibly challenging feeling, and one that kind of followed me through my childhood. So eventually, Dad somehow managed to get ordained as deacon in Suffolk, and we moved around a number of different parishes. So by the time I went to university at the age of 18, I'd lived in 6 different houses. And that's actually quite normal in a clerical family. You move around quite a lot. We were quite lucky in that all of ours remained within Suffolk, and sometimes I didn't even need to move school. Yay! But we did have to learn how to assimilate, how to join new communities, meet new people really frequently. And that's definitely been something that I've carried with me ever since. I now still find myself getting itchy feet after a few years of living in one property. But it wasn't all, there we go. But it wasn't all glamour and glorious running through fields of sugar beet growing up. In fact, it was quite clear in many ways that my family wasn't entirely what people expected from their vicar and his family. And a great example of this is my mum. Now, my mum's been disabled since she was a child. For most of my childhood, she was an ambulatory wheelchair user, mostly used a stick, is now a full-time wheelchair user. And I grew up non-disabled. This is a relatively new addition. But she had read law at Cambridge, where she'd met my dad. She dragged herself through O-level Latin in 6 months at a dodgy Coventry Comprehensive to get in. My dad had done the entrance exam and got in with a C and 2 Ds, which tells you a lot about both of them. And so she was disabled. The second my dad qualified, she went off and trained as a teacher, which she did, and she worked full-time, like almost full-time for a while. And frankly, she was a pretty terrible vicar's wife on a number of fronts, because she is awful at flower arranging. She really cannot bake to save her life, and she's definitely not safe carrying a kettle full of tea. So on many fronts, she was not what people necessarily expected. And I saw her, as a disabled woman, repeatedly patronised by people in the parish who would speak down to her. And I saw her fighting in and out of inaccessible buildings as a reader in the parish. And yet I watched my dad, who some people virtually deified by the very merit of having married a disabled woman. What a good vicar. Excellent vicaring there. But I saw this massive disparity in the way that people spoke to both my parents and these inequalities around disabilities. And similarly, my brothers could be the saintly choristers that they were, but we all have some tearaway inclinations. There was one occasion where one of them decided to run up the nave of Lincoln Cathedral on Remembrance Sunday, singing the Dam Busters theme tune, pretending to be a plane. At one point, we were invited to the Dean's house in Lincoln. It was Brandon Jackson at the time, for lunch, very posh lunch. And Gareth was found literally climbing a curtain. So we weren't necessarily the idyllic vicar's children, but I'm very pleased that my parents raised us to be very independent, very strong-minded, and to have our own views on things, including religion. And we were allowed to be loud, rambunctious teenagers with our own perspectives. There was one slightly hilarious time when we were encouraged to have some fun with religion, okay? If you can't laugh at yourself, you're missing out. And I had a boyfriend staying over, yes, in the Cathedral Close. I was 17, outrageous, I know. And he was staying over. It was the first time he'd stayed over, and I convinced him that my family all did morning prayer at 7:30 in the living room. And my father found him at 7:45 with a Bible, sitting in the living room, wondering where everyone was. He never really forgave me for that, awkwardly, but it was kind of hilarious. Still don't know where he found the Bible. So, not all Vicar's kids were quite so lucky. Angela Merkel, also a vicar's daughter, the German equivalent. And her father apparently required Merkel and her two younger siblings to be orderly and perfect. I'm very glad my dad gave that one up as a bad job very early on. But I think it is really interesting that so many of us end up going into working in politics and in the third sectors. And I think part of that is because we have a very first-hand view of wider societal issues. Apparently, as a child, I was fascinated when I found a homeless man who'd come to our house and was drinking from the outside tap, having disconnected the hose. I couldn't understand why that would be a thing. But I quickly became quite used to making sandwiches for homeless people and people who would come to the vicarage door asking for food. And that was in a very well-to-do parish. We never had any, challenging inner city jobs. These were in rural villages. People would come to our house asking for food long before churches were having to do weekly food collections for their food banks. Things have only got worse. So I do believe it is almost inevitable that my siblings and I ended up being very politically involved. My younger brother Harry worked for the Labour Party for a while. I know, we all make mistakes. I became deputy leader of the Women's Equality Party and quite involved in the People's Vote campaign. If you want an example of a champagne socialist, however, this photo was taken by Rankin, by the way, very famous photographer. It's just a bit of a mic drop there. I had to borrow this power chair for the photo shoot because mine had broken, and the only chair I could get had a broken joystick, so I replaced it with a champagne cork. I like to think of that as very adaptable and showing, circular thinking, but it worked, and it's haunted me ever since. As teenagers, we were already politically involved, and my brother once decided in the run-up to an election to put a Labour poster in the front window of the vicarage. And somebody in our very Tory parish complained to the Archdeacon, who phoned my dad. And my dad, kudos to him, explained how important it was that young people are politically engaged, and also pointed out that whilst it was a vicarage, it was also the home of these young people, and that they had a right to their own perspectives, and the poster was allowed to stay. So Dad was also quite political in his sermons, and he took a lot of pride in speaking truth to the very wealthy landowners who lived around our way, and often to the politicians who liked to come to church, particularly at Christmas. And he would use his privilege and his title and his position to try and provide those who don't have a voice, to try and ensure that their perspective was heard. And that's something that I've very much tried to take through in my career, because I'm very aware that many people, particularly disabled LGBTQ people, do not have enough of a voice in our society. However, I have doctor in front of my name, and people tend to listen when doctors say things. Somehow my patients don't, but everybody else definitely listens when doctors say things. And it's really important to me that I use that platform as best I can to try and represent my community, and that's very much what I learned from my dad. I also, somewhat conveniently, learned how to hold my own in awkward social situations, such as posh drinkies do's and dinners with too much cutlery. You know, the ones where you're sitting there going, I've got no idea which knife I use for the bread or whatever it is. I learned how to do that because I spent too many years living on a cathedral close. And that has served me very well when I've ended up having dinner at the House of Lords and I'm able to go, no, that is the glass for the red wine. Yeah, people expect that when you've got a double-barrel surname, but I wouldn't know that if it wasn't for Dad. Now, I don't know how many of you recognise this delightful piece of equipment. I'm seeing a few nods. I'm showing a bleeper or a pager. Now, this is an item that strikes fear into the hearts of basically every doctor I know. Many of us still wake up in the middle of the night hearing the beep going off and clutching at our waist, trying to work out what the buzzing is. That is the exact model of bleeper that I had. And I had a reason for fearing these long before I went into medicine, because my father was a voluntary hospital chaplain when I was growing up. So he would be paged in the middle of the night to go into hospital and sit with people at the worst times of their lives, sit with the dying and with their families. And that was, you know, something that we were very aware of, the emotional toll that that took on Dad and how important it was. And that really helped prepare me for a career in medicine where I see those kind of situations every day, unfortunately. But what I wasn't ready for was the fact that in the late 90s, I was going to upper school at the time when everyone was getting a mobile phone. And my parents were quite broke and were not convinced at the idea of giving their daughter a phone. So everybody else at school had a Nokia 3310 and was playing snakes on it. And I had a bleeper on my belt that was Dad's old hospital pager, and I would get a one-way message saying, we'll meet you at the turning circle at 4:30. So in shocking news, I was bullied quite a lot at school. I don't think, though, that it was the pager. And I don't think that it was my dad, even though he did turn up to school quite often in a cassock to do assemblies, which is always going to mark you out as a bit weird. And I don't think it was the fact that my mum was a supply teacher who also turned up to school and pretended to know how to teach maths. She's watching this, and I'm very aware that I'm going to get a lot of very angry messages when I look at my phone later. So if I'm glugging wine particularly heavily in 20 minutes' time, that's why. I don't think it was my parents. I think it was that I was a really precocious nerd. Because on my first day of upper school, we were all told to take in a reading book. And some people took Ms. Magazine, some people took the Goosebumps books or Jacqueline Wilson, and I took in the complete works of Oscar Wilde. And I was that kid who really wanted to go to uni from a slightly, challenging comprehensive. And I was that kid whose nickname was Hermione for very good reason, because I would sit in the front row with my hand up like this, even if I didn't know the answer, because I wanted the teacher to think I might. So I was taught, however, at that very young age, that it was okay to have awkward conversations and to speak truth to power. Because having raised that I was being bullied mercilessly at my first upper school, they did very little about it. And so at the age of 13, I called a meeting with the deputy headmaster and my mother, summoned them in, because that's the sort of child I was. And I told them that I was leaving the school, I was moving to the other upper school in town. I'd already spoken to Dad's church warden, who happened to be the headmaster of the other upper school, and I was going because they had not supported me when I was being bullied. And my mum just sat back and went, yeah, fine. Okay, not a problem. What was particularly awkward, though, was that my dad was a governor at the school I was leaving, as he was one of the cathedral clergy, and it was the Church of England school. But they supported that decision 100%. There was never any question that my education and my well-being was so much more important than a few awkward committee meetings. But I'm sure my dad is still secretly cursing me under his breath for those awkward committee meetings. So we grew up very aware that the world was not always a kind or an easy place. From a young age, we were answering the phone in the vicarage. And I got very good at saying, hello, the vicarage, how can I help? as a, receptionist aged 6. And sometimes you'd pick up the phone to somebody crying their eyes out because they needed to speak to the vicar. And then you'd have to send one of your siblings around the very big vicarage and into the garden and potentially up to the church to try and find said vicar, because mobile phones didn't exist, whilst you tried to placate the person on the phone crying at you. And that is definitely a skill that's come in quite handy as a medic, because now people often walk into my room and cry on me. It's not me. I promise it's not me. I just have one of those faces. But people would do that, and I had to learn to adapt. I had to learn to handle emergencies and changes of plan. And, if Dad didn't get home for dinner in time, there would be a mixing bowl upturned over his dinner plate because microwaves didn't exist then. Or if he got called out during dinner, the mixing bowl would come out again. And this adaptability served us incredibly well, particularly when we had challenges of our own as a family. So when my brother Gareth, who is the middle of this picture, was 14, he became very unwell and soon required a heart transplant after a very sudden illness. And suddenly our family was split, with half of us living in Suffolk at home, and Gareth and at least one of my parents having to be in hospital in London for a very long period. And the community really gathered around us at that point. We ate so many casseroles. Every time you opened the front door, there'd be another dish. We never knew whose dish was whose. It got very awkward. But there were casseroles, there were lifts to school, there were overnight stays, and so much love and support from this giant extended church family. And we were held. And that, I think, is why community and community building is so important to me now. Because I learned that at the worst possible times, the small things can really make life easier. And so as a doctor, that's what I try to do, because I'm incredibly aware that there's quite a gap now in our society, and actually GP surgeries are becoming the centre of our communities for many people. So I launched a few projects. We have a reusable menstrual products campaign at my surgery where you can come in, give a slip of paper to reception, and they will give you what you need. So you don't have to spend a fortune on towels and tampons and other menstrual products. And if anybody is not sure what the pink cup item is, feel free to come and ask me over drinks. I will happily explain it in graphic detail. Also, my mother is a book reviewer, and we recently had to move 4.5 tons of books from Derby to Northumberland when my dad retired. So I decided to take some of those, with her permission, and start some libraries in my waiting rooms. I like to say this is because I think it's really important people have access to literature and the ability to borrow books. Partly it's because if they have reading material, they might not realise how late I'm running. At least that's the hope. I don't know how much of them get read and how many of them are just burnt for fire or something, but they're going. They're going, and we have plenty more to go. And at the moment, I'm trying to build a community garden in my practice, because I'm very aware that a lot of the kids in my area, I work in quite a socioeconomically deprived area of Leeds, a lot of kids don't know where vegetables come from. And a lot of them, the concept of healthy eating is still quite an alien one. So hopefully if we can help them learn to grow the food, they might understand how to cook and eat the food and all of that really important stuff for their health. But in many areas, I think that the role, what was previously the role of the church, has diminished. And it's not through want of trying, but I see so much social isolation in the village I live in North Yorkshire and in the area I work in. And for many people I meet, the church is not something that springs to mind as an option for them if they're experiencing that isolation. And that isn't for want of trying by people in the church, but I think we have to acknowledge that our society has really changed in the last 20 years. But there are still many who are fighting and who are providing that community. And we've seen that in the last year as a family. So just over a year ago, my dad got a very sudden and unexpected diagnosis of terminal appendix cancer. He had a really big operation on November the 29th last year, and they realised they weren't going to be able to get it all, and he's had a lot of chemo since. And once again, despite the fact that his churches lost their vicar very quickly and abruptly, they really gathered around to support us. So again, we ate many, many casseroles. And on Christmas Day last year, Dad wasn't well enough to go to church and had told them that the thing he was most going to miss was not being able to sing the last verse of "O Come All Ye Faithful" on Christmas morning. So they brought a choir onto the drive and they sang it at us. And yes, I did bawl my eyes out. Here we go. No, we're good, we're good. We had these parishioners who were lovely, who decided to get my dad a train planter made. He's going to be really mad I can't tell you exactly which model of train it is. I have no doubt with this many theologians and train geeks in the room, somebody will know, because what somebody always knows, when a group of theologians is gathered together, one of you will be a train nerd. It's just a truth universally acknowledged. But one of my favourite experiences last Christmas was when a very old, much older lady of our parish turned up on the doorstep with a really boozy trifle and a very sweet handwritten list of all the ingredients in case of allergies, and then realised that she couldn't get her car back off our drive, which was a notoriously difficult drive to get on and off at the best of times. So having never met this woman before, not knowing her name, having actually not driven a manual car for at least 6 months, I had to get in her car and do a 27-point turn so she could go again. And that really summed up what it's like being a vicar's kid, even when you're in your 30s. So, as I explained earlier, I'm not particularly religious now, and there are a number of reasons for that. Having lost 2 brothers by the age of 27 definitely didn't help. Having a dad with a 1 in a million cancer, that's going to rock your faith a bit. But also, it's really hard to be an openly queer person in the church in 2023. And I found that the very week I tried to come out. So I came out to my parents in January 2020. And I came out to my parents within 3 days of the House of Bishops saying that sex should only be between straight married people. And I've been trying to get them together to come out to them for a good few weeks, but you need to get them both together at once. You can't tell one of them summit, because they'll tell the other one will be upset that you didn't tell them first, and oh my goodness, the drama. So I had to get them both together, and they turned up one Saturday morning in my little house in Yorkshire, which I'd owned for about a month. It wasn't really habitable. We were standing around in the kitchen, and I have to admit, I got very drunk the night before because I realised I was coming out to my parents in a lesbian bar in Manchester. And my parents turned up to find me very unwell, deeply, deeply unwell. I was all the shades of green. And my mum, being the good, strong ally that she is, went, "Well, we're not very happy with the House of Bishops this week, are we?" She didn't know. She just loves to be an ally to anyone. She really isn't that fussed. And I said, no, Mum, because I was planning on telling you I'm dating a woman. And they've really messed up the timing, I'm not going to lie. And there was a moment, and they both looked at me, and my mum said, "Well, Hannah, you borrowed all my Sarah Waters novels, so I did see this one coming." And my dad said, "Dating women sounds fun, can I have a go?" And it's so lovely because I knew long before I came out to them that there was never a second of doubt they would be incredibly supportive of me, whoever I was and whoever I loved. And I really appreciate the fact that they have had to sit, while still very much involved in the church, in a place of considerable discomfort because of that. And I very much appreciate the fact that they've been quite vocal in that discomfort. The vocalness thing is probably genetic at this point, we could admit. And now my mother runs an LGBTQ book club in Northumberland, which is lovely, even though she gets the acronym wrong every time, but she's really trying, bless her. And they both absolutely adore my girlfriend, even if they can't quite understand her veganism. So, the last gift I want to leave you with, because I figured this was probably the audience for it. As with many theological types and many clerical types, my parents have a lifelong love of learning. They just won't stop. And it's starting to get a bit awkward because we've kind of lost count of how many letters my mum has after her name. And I now live in a constant state of competition because I have to beat her eventually, damn it. So whilst they were in their last parish in Derby, they decided to take a part-time master's in public history together, because couples that study together stay together, particularly when they're 30 years older than anyone else in their class. And the local paper thought this was adorable and all this kind of stuff. And even now in retirement, my mother is learning Welsh, so she's going to be particularly horrified by the accent I did earlier. And my dad, now they live on Hadrian's Wall, keeps learning about the Roman history and the wall. He's walked it. He's got a T-shirt that says he's walked it and everything. He's very proud. But the learning they've done, and particularly this degree, they have spent their lives trying to relate it to the communities around them and trying to make that learning matter. And that's something they very much instilled in us. So when they did this public history degree, they were thinking about the churches and the communities they serve and how they could relate it back to those. My mum was thinking about how she could make public history more accessible to disabled people. And now, as I keep turning up going, oh, I've just found this exam that will make me a member of the Faculty of Sexual Medicine. No, really, I'm very excited by this one. I get 5 letters for that. Even when I turn around and say that, they just kind of roll their eyes and go, yep, you do you, kid. That's really important, and that will make a difference to people's lives. So I think I've nearly stuck to time quite well. Hopefully, I've started a bit of a conversation, which I know the other speakers in this amazing lecture series are going to very ably continue. And it has been a real joy to speak to all of you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was fabulous. And there was so much there for the others of us who grew up in an ordained household that was familiar. Some of you know I grew up in a Baptist manse, and that particular Baptist minister marched into a school parents' evening straight up to the RE teacher and said, "Are you still running away from the Lord?" And that's not a way as a kid for you to get on very well at school, especially not with your RE teacher. So as Hannah said, there is very much a sense of a constant stream of people in need when you grow up in a vicarage or a manse, and yeah, maybe that has led us into certain pathways in terms of our careers, which I hadn't really thought about before. And maybe we also need a therapy group for people who grew up in ordained households.
I'm thinking T-shirts, the works, support network for us.
Absolutely. So we do have time for questions. Vicky is poised to bring the mic to you so that people online can hear you. If you do wish to ask a question, please do raise your hand.
So say I'm really impressed with your life. Just what you've accomplished is incredible. It really is. God's really gifted you in an incredible way, and he's really blessed you with a lot. And I can see that you've accomplished a lot and you've had a really positive impact on many lives. I've had quite an opposite upbringing. I had a very broken upbringing, and I actually came to know the Lord, and that actually rescued me. So I've got quite an opposite story, as where I experienced a lot of negativity in a broken household. And I've always thought that, there's a lot of goodness in being brought up in a believer's home. And I think something that I've learned is that there is very much a difference of having a relationship with Jesus Christ and just believing and trying to abide by certain regulations and, the law and so on and so forth. And I also enjoy listening to stories and hearing how, people's lives have taken different paths and so on and so forth, because we're always learning from each other. Mm-hmm. So just as you were speaking, you started off saying that you're not religious anymore. So I'm just wondering, what is your stance now? Because you've obviously in terms of, the story of, according to the word of God, how we came about, how sin entered, and then how Jesus Christ, came to rescue us and offer us salvation. So I'm just curious as to what is your perspective now? What do you believe is going to happen, you know, after you die? And in terms of, sorry, a double question, in terms of, you know, you've had a very negative experience in terms of church and, you know, your upbringing. So do you think it's good to project that in terms of hindering other people from entering in the church and gaining salvation? Like, just what's your perspective on that? Because for me personally, like, I obviously love Jesus Christ, and I, you know, believe that salvation is so important because it gives us eternal life after we die. So I obviously believe that it's very important for people to have the opportunity to gain that, you know, because that's an eternal decision. And I'm just wondering, like, what is your stance on that? Sorry, it's quite a lot, but
no, it's really right. Goodness, what do I think about religion? Tough one. So I think this is something that is always evolving for me. And it's going to be an ongoing conversation I have with myself probably for the rest of my life. You can't grow up in a religious household and not be constantly questioning everything around you. I kind of hoped getting a theology degree might help me find some answers, and it didn't seem to. I think from my perspective, I would consider myself still a very spiritual person. I am very much somebody who will fight for the right of anybody to have religion and to be involved in religion. And if people want to join a church, right behind you. I think the church does incredible things. And I think it's really important that we have that freedom of belief in our society. For me, I'm not there yet. Maybe I will be again. Maybe I won't. I don't know. In terms of what happens after we die, I think when having lost 2 siblings and having a terminally ill father, I'm very much get through by believing that there must be something afterwards and that we're all going to see each other again. I'm not going to presume to know what that is. And I don't have any kind of fixed beliefs around what that is, but I blooming well hope it's there, because I've got a few things I need to say to my brothers, often about like cleaning up rotas and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It's an ongoing conversation. I feel very strongly, though, that people should be able to have religion, join churches, be involved. I think the church still has a huge part to play in our society, and I'm very grateful for the part that the church plays in my local community. But as for whether I'll be pottering in anytime soon, well, I haven't seen any rainbow flags outside yet, so I'm going to have to decide as and when I feel comfortable doing that. But you never know, maybe one day. I don't think anyone needs to be fixed in anything belief-wise for their entire lives.
A couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I think I used to live in Wales, so when you were mentioning the Adrian Wall, I'm like, that's one thing I haven't done there, so I wish one day I'll go back and do it. I think my question, you kind of answered it in a sense that you're a spiritual person, because what you have achieved, it requires determination, motivation. How do you motivate yourself without spirituality, even if you are not religious? And my question is, do they oppose each other as a medical doctor? Because what we see is science versus faith and spirituality. Do you find yourself in a difficult position? Sometimes science tells me this is the fact, and my spirituality says what you said. You know, I lost my sister as well, so I'm hoping I'm going to meet her somewhere sometime. Yeah. It's just, you know, that consciousness and transcendence is just keeps me, you know, being hopeful. Mm-hmm. Do you find it, you know, kind of contradicting your as a medical doctor, because we are all doctors, but doctors of states, it's just the same thing?
The answer is yes. It can be a very tricky one to combine this kind of scientific background. I know I'm a doctor, but I rarely consider myself a scientist. I don't have any science A-levels. I just took a really convoluted route in, and I keep worrying my med school is going to call me and tell me it was all a mistake. I've been going for 7 years now, so I think it's a bit late for that. But I think when it comes to science and religion, there's an extent to which we kind of always draw this dichotomy between the two, and I'm not sure it's always necessary. I think we're constantly learning in both, and we're constantly exploring in both, and neither has all the answers. So I don't think we need to rush to kind of constantly oppose them against each other. I think it is really interesting, though. I did Wikipedia search last night of famous vicars' kids. I'm not on it. Yes, I'm just saying, if anyone can edit Wikipedia. Thank you. But yeah. But there are a lot of scientists on there. Like, I think Thomas Edison was a vicar's kid. There are many, many scientists who were clerical children. And I think part of that is because of our exposure to high quality education, because if you were a vicar's kid, like in the past, you often got a better education as a result. So that was part of it. But I think also many of us have had to kind of have this discussion. I think one of the more challenging ones is when you're constantly faced with horrific trauma and awful situations, marrying that up with the concept of a loving God, I find far harder than marrying that up with science. And I think that's a really challenging conversation. And it's one that, you know, my patients will sometimes try and have with me. I've had clerical patients who've kind of gone, this is really crap. And I was like, yes, no, I know it is. And having those conversations I find really challenging, because you sit there going, this is horrific. And it doesn't seem fair. And it isn't fair. But where does religion sit in there? And I think that's the conversation that we do need to have a lot more, because I think a lot of people who are very religious find themselves at what is already an incredibly traumatic time trying to solve that issue, sometimes for the first time, and the psychological challenges of that when you're already incredibly unwell or watching someone you love die, that's really hard. And how we have those conversations, I think, is really important before the point when people get to end of life and the like.
Thank you for that talk. It was, really interesting to think about. My question would be, sort of with your upbringing, I can tell that it's a very professional thing to work in a church. I'm currently discerning vocation, so I'm looking at going down that pathway. And I find that it's very difficult to go to a new church and create bonds with people and make friendships while also keeping that professional, boundaries. So I'm just wondering about, during your upbringing and, being as a child and having those different churches to go about and always moving, how do you still remain those boundaries, being the vicar's child?
It's really tricky, and that's definitely something that I've kind of come across in medicine as well. So there's a kind of adage as a GP that you should never work where you practice, partly because otherwise you'll wander into the pub and you'll go, oh my goodness, I've had to stick my finger up a lot of bottoms in this room. You don't want that over a pint. It's very awkward. Nobody was expecting me to say that today, were they? No, that's not what you came to the Ebor Lectures for. But having those boundaries is really difficult, particularly when you're supporting people at the worst times of their life. And I don't think there's any way to always get it right. You're always going to get it wrong in some circumstances. And I have this a lot as a doctor who's got a very big kind of public persona, where I have patients who come, having seen me on Instagram or on Twitter or in the media, or they've seen me contesting elections, and then turn up in my room and go, oh, it's you. And that can be a really difficult conversation. I don't think there are any right answers. And I think it kind of comes with a bit of practice and just having very clear boundaries about what you are able to share and what you're not. So it's a bit like being a therapist in a way. I have a very clear setup where if I ever meet my therapist out in the wild, because apparently they do stray into the wild, if I ever meet her in the wild, if I go and say hello, then she'll acknowledge she knows me. Otherwise, we pretend we don't know each other. And it's about thinking about those kind of boundaries, I think, can be really helpful. But there isn't a clear answer. And it's going to vary from person to person, because some people in your parish will want to be your best friend. And I have walked into the living room and found random congregants ironing my father's boxes whilst babysitting us. Like, that sort of thing happens. It's very odd. But those boundaries are always going to get blurred, and it can be really challenging because fundamentally they are your neighbours as well as your parishioners. And how you balance that is, there's no right answer.
Vicky, we are running out of time. There's one question over here. If we can make that a quick one, please. If you just wait for the microphone.
Yep. Just so the people online can hear you, so my father can judge my answers. Hi, Dad. Sorry.
He might not like what I have to say. It's basically revisiting what a previous person was asking about. I'm a retired medic. My background is very science-based. And so for me, I'm very black and white. I just cannot combine a faith with medicine. And I wish I could, because when the Queen died, Queen Elizabeth died, I remember thinking, I so envy her faith, because she was very religious. She truly believed, and I really did feel envy. So for me, the only way to sort of deal with it is to try to be a good person. Just try to be a good person and not try to think about a higher being, because it is just doesn't work with science. And I'm sorry if that, offends some people, but it's so black and white for me.
I think it's really important that we're all able to have those differing views on it. And that's why conversations like this are so important, isn't it? Because we are all coming at this from very different areas and backgrounds. And I sit probably somewhere in between the middle of you two, and that's fine too. So yeah, I completely see where you're coming from. And I know you're very much not alone in the medical profession.
I'm afraid we are out of time. There were a couple more questions, but we do have a drinks reception, and Hannah will hopefully be staying around for a while, so you'll be able to ask her those questions outside. We have just had a question online as well from somebody who remembers you from Cathedral Close days.
Look,
wants to know if you had children, are there things you would do differently from the way your parents did things?
I mean, I probably wouldn't bring them up in a vicarage, because I think if I broke into a vicarage to bring up children, people would find that quite odd. No, honestly, I think they did a really good job of raising us in what is quite a tricky situation, because, I'm very aware if I have kids, there's a sizable chance a lot of their friends will know me as the local GP, and how you balance that. So I can't guarantee they'll have much of a different upbringing, though fortunately we don't do as many kind of like late night, middle of the night call outs for doctors anymore. So hopefully they'll get a decent night's sleep. Fingers crossed.
Before we thank Hannah again and move through for the drinks reception, I'll just remind you that our next Ebor lecture is in May, and we have Rupert Reed, the climate activist, is going to be here. So do keep an eye out for publicity and book your tickets for that one. Thank you very much for being with us online and in person. Thank you.